Today, in this presentation, we're going to talk about human-seaweeds interactions on the Breton and Welsh coasts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so first, I will start with an overview of the broader context of my PhD thesis from which this paper is drawn. And then I will delve on two key aspects of these human-seaweeds interactions, their harvesting and their consuming by people on the Breton and Welsh coasts. So I just got the green light from my supervisors to focus on seaweed specifically for my, my thesis. I've only recently started really diving into the world of marine algae. Okay, so my thesis interrogates the role of the more than human constituents of coasts in shaping the identities, values, and practices of their inhabitants. And it compares and weaves together case studies from Breton and Welsh to evaluate what emerged out of local circumstances and what resulted from wider forces at work in the environment. So I understand coasts not as margins or peripheries of delineated entities, be it the land or the sea. Rather, I draw on the works of coastal historians such as Michael Pearson and John Gillis, who describe coasts as the symbiosis between land and sea and the ecotones where earth and water meet. And thus, with these ideas of transitional areas of coming together, I approach the coast as a hybrid zone of marine and terrestrial milieu, where different ecosystems and cultures merge, interact, and as a result, give rise to a new formation to a new amphibious formation. In turn, this formation provides a privileged site for the study of multi-species relations, and I'm going to echo the first two papers. So within this more than human approach that I use, and as formulated by Emily O'Gorman and Andrea Gaynor, the environment is understood as a nexus in which, quote, the past and the present are dynamically co-constituted by multiple organisms, including plants, animals, and fungi, as well as by elements and forces from water to minerals. Doing so allows me to integrate and shed light on the complex and varied relationships that existed between human and non-human actors in the coastal environment. So to do all this, I use seaweed as an embodiment of the amphibious state or the amphibious condition of the coast of sea-land entanglements. Seaweeds that grow where water and land meet, they are hidden and exposed to the rhythm of the tides. They are essential to other marine species in coastal waters, used within coastal communities, but also well into their hinterlands in farming or medicine, for instance. So with this work, I seek to participate in the fuller integration of littorals and other wet and hybrid spaces in environmental history, and to show the benefits that comparative studies present to nuance the influence of the environment and its hybrid more than human constituents in contemporary lives. So this paper really is part of a chapter from my thesis about the many lives of algae that examines the physical and spiritual nourishment that seaweed provided on the watery edges of Breton and Welsh. So today I focus on their omnipresence in the surroundings and lives of coastal dwellers to show their roles in nourishing the bodies and lived experiences locally. So in the period, the sea was and had been for a long time established as an infinite provider of resources from which large quantities of fish, seashells, seaweeds, and other species could be harvested. Seaweeds grew in abundance on the Breton and Welsh coasts, thanks to the climate and geography of the Atlantic facade of Western Europe. And every day, the sea there also spat out large quantities of seaweeds of all sorts, a diversity that usages of the resource mirrored. Seaweed served diverse purposes for those who lived on and off these coasts, and the meanings that they ascribe to them have repeatedly changed over time. So seaweeds were readily available and easily accessible resources that provided sustenance, labor, and income to coastal communities. In Brittany, their harvest generated an average of 3 million francs per year in the late 19th century, and the activity still provided employment for many well into the 20th century. Seaweeds washed off the Breton shore in large amounts. And as a contemporary observer noted in his 1937 PhD thesis on seaweeds in human and veterinary medicine, they turned vast expanses of sands into beautiful apple green grasslands. And soon he further explains that brave people filled these coastal meadows and started, quote, raking this aquatic richness, each one more so than the other. And while the tide is low, they wreck this goémon that seems inexhaustible, and they will continue when the tide ebbs again, if the wind and currents have not changed, and continue to wash off this richness that is gathered on the shore for next to nothing. In turn, this labor of gathering seaweed fostered a particular engagement with the environment. Armed with their rakes and baskets, gatherers collected the algal treasure all day long. This was far from being a solo activity in which only a few took part. On the contrary, the group dimension of seaweed collecting was prominent, as we can see on the two photographs on the slide here. And in a specialist publication about the health of aquatic animals and plants in France, an unnamed observer reported on experiencing a harvest of seaweeds. He wrote, "Kelp is an important resource for all the inhabitants of the littoral. The kelp harvest is a real festival in Brittany for the villages which are invited to it one after another. This crowd of kelp cutters is feverish. A rock that is richer than the others is in some way stormed before it is abandoned by the sea. There is nothing quite as splendid as one of these heavy vehicles bending under the weight of a mountain dripping with marine plants, with seaweed sweeping the shore with their broad leaves like transparent scarves. Impatient to bring back to the farm its wet treasure, still exhaling the scents of the sea, the carriage itself becomes animated, overexcited by the humming, by the cries of the human anthill that surrounds it, and joyfully shakes its collars, adorned with rackety bells, its harnesses adorned with colorful tassels." He makes the significance of what the sea had to offer to coastal dwellers clear from the opening line. Not only does it provide a resource to exploit, but also a cultural tradition to uphold, as the harrowing task of harvesting is given celebratory qualities here. Diving into this scene reveals a ritualistic festival that is bustling with people, movements, and objects, and that rapidly becomes overwhelming as a feverish crowd storms and raids the coast for its seaweed. As symbols of abundance and hard work, the quantities of seaweed harvested gain aesthetic qualities in the gaze of the observer, to whom no sight is more beautiful than that of a cart loaded with seaweed. Progressively, as the scene continues to unfold, it is no longer just sight that is stimulated. The wet treasure and scents of the sea, the humming, the cries, and the rackety bells mingle into one powerful sensory experience. This emphasis on the sensory character of the scene suggests that by means of intimate engagement with the seaweed, human and non-human protagonists, people and environment merge together. For those who engaged with seaweeds in their daily lives, the sensory engagement was total. The stimulation of smell and touch add additional means of engagement with the seaweeds. Embracing this more than visual experience enriched contemporaries' connections to their surroundings in which they evolved, and educated their perceptions to the varieties of human-environment interactions that could exist on the coast. This description of the harvest highlights a specific form of engagement with the coast. It suggests that direct engagement with the environment fashioned experiences both as an individual and as a group. As Aidan O'Sullivan, a historian of fishing practices in medieval Ireland, explained, those who spent their days in coastal waters, actively shape their own identities through their practical knowledge of and encounters with these environments. In 1910, an observer, Legendre, in an article on foraging at low tide, remarked that from tradition, those who fished and harvested the sea knew that in this location, this species was found, in this season, another species is gathered. And that this was made possible thanks to the passing of knowledge from one generation to another. Through their labor, they developed a multi-sensory engagement with the seaweed, which provided them with intimate knowledge of their environment on the amphibious coast. Their environment and culture, material and immaterial, were intimately and intricately linked. And yet sight, smell, hearing, and touch were not the only senses to be triggered by seaweed. Another form of engagement took contemporaries' experiences further. To food anthropologist and historian Carrie O'Connor, the consumption of things, including seaweeds, represents the ultimate act of engagement with the environment. Their taste, then, was also an integral part of the algal experience in the period. Seaweeds have long been and still are popular components of coastal diets in Wales and to a lesser extent in Brittany. Indeed, since ancient times, seaweed has been considered as an ordinary food among coastal populations in Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland, and also further away in Denmark and Norway. While the tradition of eating seaweed had died down in many places by the early 20th century, it retained its hold on the local cuisine of South Wales. In the 1930s, laverweed, the seaweed used in the preparation of the sought-after national dish known as laver bread, was still gathered in large quantities in various locations along its shoreline. On the coast of Gower, for instance, manufacturers working in factories or private houses bought seaweed off local gatherers or from locations from farther away in Britain and transformed them into the sea delicacy. For instance, it was noted that there was one individual in the region who was said to be able to prepare 6 tons of seaweeds weekly during the whole year. Those enormous quantities of laver bread prepared for a widely spread market, and emphasize the importance of the sector as provider of income for gatherers and manufacturers. The sales of laver bread were steady, and canning techniques followed the modern scientific conditions of food processing, thereby allowing the delicacy to reach a wider consumer market. As Welsh algalogist Kenneth Rees explained, the demand is now exceeding the supply, and it may well be that in the near future, some attempt at cultivation will be instituted. The future of the marine plant, of the marine resource in Wales, seemed to be promising. Indeed, in 1940, he further underlined that several of the workmen engaged upon the construction of the Oakfall in Mumble's Head, near Swansea, were fond of laver bread, which in the area around Swansea is a favorite dish for Sunday's breakfast, and week by week, before leaving work on Saturday, they would tear away large quantities of porphyra, that's the seaweed that is used to make laver bread. So the routine gathering of seaweeds by coastal dwellers engaged in activities not directly related to the seaweed sector points to their long-lasting popularity as stable foods. And the pervasiveness of seaweed in coastal economies and cultures highlights its central place in the very functioning of their communities, not merely the nourishment of the poor in times of distress or way out of poverty for laborers, as it could be sometimes perceived by outside observers. Seaweed fashioned relationships between people on the coast, in turn revealing their attitudes to an environment that provided and with which they merged. So the usages of seaweeds that I just talked about highlight their intrinsic utilitarian values for the coastal populations who harvested and ate them. Marine algae blurred boundaries between human and non-human, between terrestrial and marine environments. By emphasizing the porosity of the littoral and highlighting the extent of its reach in communities, seaweeds reveal the amphibious character of the coast, ecologically as much as socially and culturally. So, and yet, seaweeds were not simply restricted to these rather utilitarian values. The next part of this chapter retraces the evolutions of the ways in which seaweeds were depicted across species and media in Britain and Wales in late 19th to the 19th, from the late 19th century to the 1930s. It shows that seaweed also permitted visual representations on the coast, and as such nourished the minds of the people who encountered it in Brittany and Wales. In turn, these artistic representations unearth additional layers of understanding. Seaweeds incarnated the evolutions in contemporaries' imaginaries about Breton and Welsh landscapes as places devoid of, or on the contrary, fashioned by humans, or as spaces where the divine and the hellish could be encountered, as subject to showcase the extension of algological knowledge to the art world, and as anchors for immemorial practices. So ecologically and culturally, as much as physically and figuratively, seaweeds merge marine and terrestrial as much as they wove together people to their amphibious environment. So yeah, thank you very much for listening to this paper.